Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them. At what point, is there a red line crossed where we're in the danger zone, or did we already cross it in terms of a move towards authoritarianism?
I think we're there. The moment is now.
My guest today is Elizabeth Neumann. She is former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism for the Department of Homeland Security and currently works as Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot. And she's also a national security contributor for ABC News. And she's the author of Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. That's what the cover looks like for those watching on video. Elizabeth Neumann, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nap.
All right, so we're going to talk about political extremism today. Before we get into that, let's kind of define our terms. How do you define political extremism?
Yeah, so coming from that counterterrorism background, I focus on violent extremism mostly. And in my field, extremism is when a group or an individual perceives a threat to their success or survival by some outgroup and believes that the only recourse they have is some form of hostile action. So it's not when you perceive a threat and you think, therefore, I'm going to go vote, therefore, I'm going to go raise money, therefore, I'm going to go protest. Those are all legitimate ways to address our concerns. It's when we take that next step and say, therefore, I'm going to commit hostile action because that's the only choice I have. Hostile action in my field is a spectrum. There's non-criminal hostile action and then criminal. The hostile action that's non-criminal might be threats, bullying, intimidation, things that are not good, things that tell us that civil society is unraveling because we have an increase of that. And from my perspective, the reason I really care about the increase of more hate speech and bullying and intimidation is because we know that when you have more of that, some small percentage do move to that criminal space, which might be an actual hate crime, or worse, like terrorism and genocide, or the upper end of the spectrum. So I'm looking at it through a lens of you're perceiving that threat to your success and survival, and therefore you have to commit some form of hostile action. That is extremism to me.
And where are those biggest threats coming from today, domestically?
Yeah, it is morphing at the speed of the internet, you might say. There are the traditional types of extremism that we've had in this country for all sorts of decades, even centuries. White supremacy being one of the core ones. Anti-government extremism actually goes back several centuries in the United States. But some of the newer types are a blending of different ideologies. It's almost a build your own ideology on the internet. It is heavily nihilistic. There's a lot of recent cases, even the assassination of the United CEO, healthcare CEO, or the first assassination attempt on Trump. Those perpetrators had kind of a nihilistic worldview. And we're seeing that increasingly in school shootings. We're seeing that in all sorts of rhetoric and extremist conversations that occur online. So today's threat does look a little bit different than just 3 or 4 years ago, where we were predominantly focused on anti-government and white supremacist extremism. It is now all of that, plus conspiracy theories, plus this undercurrent of nihilism and there's no hope. Let's just burn it all down.
Yeah, and so in your book is about Christian extremism, and one of the things that I've struggled to make sense of is, I'm going to take for an example the J6 riot. You had a lot of extremist groups like Proud Boys and white supremacist groups that had this history of extremism, who were marching alongside evangelical Christians singing worship songs. A lot of these people had no criminal record, no history of belonging to an extremist group. Yet here they are, they're marching alongside white supremacists. So how did that happen? How did that alliance end up being, the case?
It's the thing that prompted me to drive and study for 3 years to write this book, because I had my own moment watching January 6th going, I've spent 20 years in the counterterrorism community since 9/11, trying to protect this country from another 9/11, from a threat caused by a different religion, from people far away across the globe. And on January 6th, it was people from literally my hometown, people from my political party, and people from my faith. And it really jarred me that here we've spent trillions of dollars in trying to keep the country safe. And the first successful attack on the US Capitol came from within. And why did we miss that? Why did we not see that threat for what it was? And I want to be careful. I am not comparing the size and scale of 9/11 to January 6th. There is no comparison. But from a security perspective, they're both security failures. And so in my field, when we fail, we always look at why we failed. And part of the reason we failed on January 6th is we didn't see that threat. We kind of dismissed it. We kind of were like, oh, they would never actually do anything to cause harm. They're just rabble rousers. And why we drew that conclusion, why there was like that cognitive bias, assuming the best of our side versus the worst of the other guys. I think that's something the community continues to grapple with. It is, anytime you're in the security field, we are increasingly learning that there is cognitive bias, and we think better of people that look like us or sound like us. That's actually social science. Psychologists have kind of proven that. But deeper for me was also realizing that some of the narratives that were playing out on January 6th were narratives that I steeped in as a conservative, going back to my teen and college years in the 1990s. I fully was wholeheartedly with where some of those January 6th protesters were arguing, and I kind of felt a kinship with their anger and their frustration towards their government. And so I was trying to understand how do you have some people who I believe were lied to, and that's why they showed up on January 6th, and they genuinely believed that the government or certain factions within the government had stolen the election, and they were expressing their First Amendment right, as they had a right to do. But to your point, Nat, they're walking alongside actual organized extremist groups. They're walking alongside people carrying Nazi signs and like things that you don't have to have a graduate degree or counterterrorism expertise to know, oh, those are signs about bad things. I don't want to be affiliated with those guys. And I appreciate that there are some signs and some symbols that the average person wouldn't know are affiliated with those organized extremist groups. But there is like an old principle that I was taught growing up, that if you're associating with people of ill repute, you might need to check whether you need to be there, whether maybe this isn't a situation of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? It is a association matters. And so I think as Christians, we have a higher standard than the political sphere. And part of that standard is being wise to understand that there were people in that crowd bent on violence because that's what it means to be an extremist, that you are now using hostile action to get your way. Using hostile action is inherently against everything that Christ taught us about what our purpose is in this world. And hey, I'm the first one to say that as a Christian, we absolutely can be involved in the political sphere, and that we should steward our vote well, and that we should be engaged in our communities and making our communities better. That it is loving your neighbor by being engaged in civil and civic flourishing. So I'm not saying that you have to go escape the world and ignore politics, but we are told not to use the tools of the world in the way that we engage in politics. And so I think that we've watched over the last decades the church increasingly adapt and adopt the world's power tools. That the goal is power as opposed to loving our neighbor. And very clear arguments that have been made by people that are kind of intellectual in the MAGA community, that the end does justify the means. The how doesn't matter. And that is antithetical to what Jesus taught us. He said, you should be focused on the how and let me deal with the results. And I think that in the last at least 3-4 decades, we've watched the church kind of make a bargain with the political sphere, say, hey, if you'll protect us, you'll give us some power, we will turn a blind eye to all of our misgivings of your character and your competence. And that's effectively what we've seen happen. And yes, January 6th was one particular moment where it was very visible what the results can be when the church gives up its moral authority to say it is wrong to commit acts of violence. It's wrong to be bullying and threatening people. But when you are basically in bed now with the political sphere, the church have lost that moral clarity and our ability to kind of push the powers of the world back from the brink. And that's kind of the moment we find ourselves in, as we do have a church that has become complicit, and in so doing is complicit with extremists. Now, I don't think most believers who are caught up in the politics of the moment are advocating for violence. That is not what I am saying. But I am saying we're too close. We're too close for comfort. And by being adjacent to them and not speaking with moral clarity, we are in effect empowering them.
Do you have a sense of how big this is? Like what portion of like church-going Christians are moving in the direction of political extremism, perhaps to the point of taking up political violence? Of course, J6 was an act of political violence, but outside of J6 even, how big is this problem?
Yeah, when we have run polls over the last couple of years asking Americans, so not specific to churchgoers, but we ask Americans how open they are to violence as a solution to their political concerns, their political grievances. In the last 4 or 5 years, that number has ranged from anywhere between 25, 26% up to 40% of the adult population. It does appear to have peaked around 2023, but it's come off its high, and it's still pretty uncomfortable for me. It's around the 26th percentile. That roughly equates to something around 60 million adults and Americans. If you assume 50% of the population, it's a little less than 50% are believers or Christians or profess to be Christians. You're looking at 30 million. It's too many is the problem. Now, most people, when they answer that question, are not actually going to go out and do something violent. It is a very, very small percentage that ever actually start planning, ideating, and moving towards violence. But the step to get to that violence is that cognitive opening, this moral justification that violence is necessary. And for context, in the United States, we have about 800,000 sworn law enforcement officers in this country. So 800,000 compared to 60 million potentially violent people. Like there's just no room there for us to police our way out of this, nor do I think we want to, because what we're talking about is a belief, and you're allowed to believe whatever you want in this country. That's the beautiful thing about the First Amendment. What you're not allowed to do is act on it. But when you're talking about trying to prevent violence and trying to prevent other criminal behavior, one of the strongest tools we have is in civil society. It is talking to the average person who doesn't want violence, and helping them understand that in order for us to reduce the amount of people that are open to violence, we actually need to start talking about this. We need to start reclaiming some of those civic norms that made this country so great. This idea that the entire founding of the country came from this idea of, after 400 years of religious wars, maybe we can find a better way out of this without having to kill each other over our religious beliefs, right? This country was founded based on pluralism. We had a whole bunch of people seeking religious freedom. So that, like, in that context, we should be proud of engaging with people that think differently than us and not view them as an enemy or a threat to us, right? Like, we kind of need to go back and reclaim some of those. Why did the founders do it this way? Why did many early Christians in this country see this as a blessing from the Lord, that we have this thing called a democratic republic, and actually treasure that as a virtue and as a value? And what does that look like day to day in our life? It means we should be friends with people that have different viewpoints than us. Like, we should go to church where not everybody thinks the same way. We should be engaging with people and learning, if we don't know how, seeking opportunities to learn how to disagree well. Not for the purpose of like persuading somebody to your viewpoint, but because they're a human being made in God's image and God placed them in your life. And so therefore loving them is loving all of them and appreciating their perspective, even if it doesn't change your mind. That's okay. But I know what I'm describing almost sounds like, that laundry list of everything good I learned in kindergarten. Kind of that's what we need. We really need to go back to the basics of, we should be kind to one another. We should not take out our anger on one another. We should disagree peaceably, not perceive others as a threat. We should practice charity and grace and give people the benefit of the doubt. These sound really basic, but when you peel back the layers behind ideologies that promote violence, it's because that part of our societal fabric has frayed and in places is very, very broken. And so it's going to take good people, people of goodwill, coming together, but talking about it. This virtue is important, teaching it to our children, talking about it in our workplaces, talking about it in our schools, and reclaiming those virtues as more important than our polarized tribal politics.
So you worked during the first Trump administration at the Department of Homeland Security. Just recently, Trump had an executive order specifically targeting Miles Taylor, who left the Trump administration in protest about the same time that you left the Trump administration in protest. I don't know, what were your thoughts, your reaction when you saw that executive order specifically mentioning Miles?
Yeah, my other colleague, Chris Krebs, was also named, and they are both friends. They are patriots in my mind, had the courage of their convictions to speak the truth, knowing that they were putting themselves at risk. Both of them faced threats when they came out back in 2020, as did I when I spoke out. There are many dark trolls on the internet that viewed the idea of a Republican speaking out against a Republican president as treacherous, as treasonous. And there were a number of threats, and in some cases, my colleagues experienced way more than I did. And I feel thankful that my family didn't have to go through some of the things that they've had to go through. So when they were named in the Oval Office, um, my first thought was, okay, the threats are going to come again. So your first thought is they have children, families, and they have to take protective measures to make sure that their families are safe. And I hate that that's the moment that we live in this country. They are not the only ones facing threats. Threats against all elected officials have been going through the roof in the last 2 years on both sides. Marjorie Taylor Greene is one of the most threatened politicians out there, as is AOC, Alexandra Cortez. Like, women tend to be the most threatened, but it doesn't matter which side of the political sphere you're coming from. If you take a stand, you get threats, which goes back to what we were just talking about. That's not okay in a democracy. We want our elected officials to speak their mind and represent their values and their people without the fear of retaliation. The only fear they should have is in the voting booth, right? That's how we address our differences. It's not by threats and intimidation and worse, actual acts of violence. So Miles and Chris Krebs are in my prayers, and I've been in touch with them. They are going to fight this, and which is the right answer. I think we've seen in a number of instances where the administration has tried to exact revenge on political enemies, such as law firms, educational institutions, individuals. They've done a number of executive orders where they have named individuals and removed their security clearances. This is not okay. That is not how our government is set up. The president of the United States is not a king. It is not designed to be a monarchy. The founders did that quite intentionally. And a lot of both norms and quite possibly constitutional rights are being violated right now. I have tremendous confidence in the courts. They so far are being the bulwark for us. I would like to see Congress to do their job. It's Congress's job to hold the president accountable if he continues to do these unconstitutional actions. Now, I'm not Pollyanna. I don't see this Congress exercising their rights to impeach. But I would hope that they start using their voices and expressing their dismay at how many civil liberties and civil rights are being violated, the abuse of power, the rule of law is all being flouted by this administration. And it's important for not only the courts and the Congress, but we the people to express our displeasure with this peacefully display, but that's how that's done. And I don't know, our generations, we really have not had a moment quite like this, where it's really now coming down to we the people, the consent of the governed, to express this is not okay. We want something better.
Yeah. And I mean, since our listeners, maybe not all of them will know this, but you've been a friend of mine for a long time. And honestly, I'm worried about you. I'm worried that he might come after you next. Do you have a plan? I mean, are you ready for this? I mean, do we need to like surround your house? What's going to happen?
I appreciate the support. Honestly, the most important thing, if anybody is so moved, is to pray. The Lord was so gracious and protected my family and me back in 2020. And I watched that play out in very real and tangible ways that I'm absolutely convinced it was not happenstance, but the Lord and many faithful people that were joining us in prayer as I went through that season. We do have plans if I were to be named. We have already taken a number of security precautions to make it more difficult for people to find us. And of course, I have children too. So that's probably the thing that I am most concerned about. There are a number of organizations that were preparing for a second Trump administration and the expectation that he might use lawfare, if you will, abuse the criminal justice and civil court systems to try to go after his political enemies. And they have pulled together funds and lawyers and legal resources to be able to protect people. So I feel fairly comfortable that should that happen, I actually think it's a low likelihood, because I was not nearly as high up on the radar as Miles and Krebs were. But if it were to come to that, I am thankful that there are others that have prepared for that, so that there's a way to legally fight this. But look, when we spoke out in 2020, we knew there was significant risk, both security risk as well as retaliatory risk. And it was the right thing to do. We had seen things. We felt like the American public needed to know how dangerous he was. Sadly, you are now seeing what we warned about. He has authoritarian tendencies. He is not bound by any sort of moral code. And the cruelty that we are seeing laid out against any number of people. And you have to remember, to restate what Knapp's already said, I'm a national security official. I am for strong borders. If you are here unlawfully and you go through due process, yes, we need to deport you. I am not sitting here opposed to some of their what they state their goals are. My concern is the way in which they are doing it is unlawful. The way in which they are carrying out their agenda is cruel and inhumane and morally wrong. And we, the American public, or the United States of America, can do better than this. We have done better than this for all of our flaws that we have had in our history. We often look back on the mistakes and say we shouldn't have done that, right? But we didn't perpetrate those abuses usually for the sake of being malicious. It was not coming from, it was pride, it was hubris. It was, I'm thinking about the Iraq War, right? I'm thinking about Japanese internment. I'm thinking about enhanced interrogation after 9/11. This country has made mistakes before and has violated civil liberties. This is not new. What is new about this moment is that the people that are perpetrating those abuses are intentionally seeking to violate civil liberties. They are intentionally seeking to be malicious, not out of fear, not out of misunderstanding, but because the cruelty is a joy for them. Like that is very dark and dangerous. And as believers, we need to be praying against this. I think this is hugely a spiritual battle at play right now. But we also need to be speaking out about a clarion call for, we want our government to be moral in its administration of the laws and lawful in the administration of the laws.
And here at the American Values Coalition, we've been bringing attention to a lot of the anti-democratic actions taken by the Trump administration. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, you can find more information at americanvalues.org and sign up for our newsletter. But just to give you some context for my next question, we are recording this podcast on April 18th, Good Friday. So the big story in the news today is the Garcia case, but we also wrote about Harvard this week. There's just so much going on. It's like hard to wrap your head around, what's the most dangerous thing. But at what point, is there a red line crossed where we're in the danger zone, or did we already cross it? Are we already in the danger zone? And in terms of the move towards authoritarianism taking place in the executive branch, where are we at now?
I think we're there. The moment is now. And I've been a big proponent of encouraging people not to say the sky is falling yet. When they were doing lawful things that were maybe cruel, I think there was a place for us to say, no, you can do better. You should do this humanely. But don't say the sky is falling when they're operating within the bounds of the law. And some of our immigration laws are there's a lot of gray zones, gray areas. There's a lot of discretion in the executive branch and just because it hasn't been exercised previously doesn't mean that their exercising of it now is unlawful. So an example of this might be Secretary Rubio rescinding visas. He has the lawful means to do that. He has a lot of discretion to do that. Now, there have been lots of reasons historically why that ability has been used very sparingly and judiciously. I think it's unwise what he is doing, in addition to being cruel. But a lot of the cases that are moving forward, the judges are allowing the rescissions of the visas and for those individuals to be sent home because it is within the bounds of the law. So I'm not getting to a place of the constitutional crisis is here lightly. I think what we're watching play out this week is an administration that is thumbing their nose at the courts. And the courts are giving them firm direction, but also a lot of, I would say not leeway, but just they're giving them multiple attempts to get this right. Are you really sure that that's the answer that you want to provide? I asked you for more information. I'm going to let you come back to me tomorrow with more information. And just in the last few days, we are starting to see multiple judges push back and say, okay, you are now in the territory of flouting what is clearly the direction of the courts. In one case, in the Garcia case, that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court told the administration they had to abide by the district court's ruling. And what we have watched this week is this administration try to spin a tale about what the Supreme Court said that is not at all what the plain reading of the Supreme Court's decision is. And that is very concerning. It's concerning because they clearly know they're trying to play to their audience. And that echo chamber, here yet again, we're going to end up much like January 6th became this very different event for people. Even if you watched it on TV, if you then participated in one echo chamber versus the other, your story today, 4 years later, about what January 6th was is very, very different because you listened to different narratives after the fact. And that's what they're trying to do right now. They're trying to create a different narrative for their base. Meanwhile, if anybody goes and reads the Supreme Court's directive, it's only 2 paragraphs. Like there's a little bit of front end and back end, and there is a dissent of sorts from 3 justices at the very end that's a little bit longer. But the actual court order is really short. I would encourage you to just go read it for yourself and go like, yeah, this is pretty clear what they're supposed to do. And then for them to sit in the Oval Office, as they did this week with the president of El Salvador, and be like, oh, it's out of our hands, there's nothing we can do. It defies all common sense. And you really are like, do you think we're that stupid? But apparently they do. Apparently they think they can wink and nod and be cute. Yeah. And that's where is it a blatant, did Trump come out and say, I'm ignoring the Supreme Court? No, but that's not how they operate. I wasn't looking for them to do it that bluntly. What they're doing is kind of testing the boundaries. Like, I'm not going to comply with this. I'm going to weave a narrative why I'm not complying with it. I'm going to claim that I can't comply with it. But in fact, they are now defying the Supreme Court. So we now have 2 branches of our constitutional system that are in conflict, and 200 plus years of precedent, going back to Marbury versus Madison, being overturned in his action. And the only way that we can redress this is either through impeachment or through our vote. And I just don't see that the Congress is going to impeach. So it will be up to the voters in 2026 during the congressional elections to let their voices be heard. And then certainly in 2028. But it does... there's a part of, like, when you play all of this out, one of the most anxiety producing parts of the moment that we find ourselves in is there's so little recourse. The courts are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, and I imagine they will continue to do what they are supposed to do, but they don't have enforcement capability. That's the executive branch, right? So usually when somebody defies a court order, the judge orders the U.S. Marshals to go you go through contempt proceedings and they can get thrown in jail, but it's the U.S. Marshals that handle that. Well, the U.S. Marshals are executive branch officials that report ultimately up to the President of the United States. So we are now in a conflict where who do the U.S. Marshals listen to, right? And so that's the moment we find ourselves in. That doesn't mean that we lose the republic tomorrow, but it does mean we're in a very dark period for the next 3.5 years, absent somebody in the very few number of people that have control over Trump stepping in and telling him to knock it off. And I think that the number of people that can do that is very, very small. We are in for a dark few years. And what I mean by dark is if you can do that to the legal permanent resident that was here in the United States in Maryland, and just disappear him to El Salvador, say, whoops, what happens when they start doing that to U.S. citizens? Whoops, we can't go get them back. And what happens when the mass deportations, which haven't even started yet, by the way, when they get going, you will end up with U.S. citizens being deported, because there's just no way to do things at that scale that they're talking about doing without making mistakes. So we are setting ourselves up for civil liberties violations unlike anything we've ever seen in our lifetimes, and not really being able to address it until a new president is in office.
Yeah, and they were already making mistakes. Just this week, they put a U.S. citizen in ICE custody in Florida. Someone with a U.S. birth certificate was rounded up, along with his group of friends. And we should also point out they're defying the courts on the easiest case. This is like they admitted they mistakenly sent him there. And this is the case that they're defying the courts on. Every person who was sent there without due process.
That's right.
And to the point of the reason we have due process, they could just call anyone an illegal alien. If you have no due process, you can't prove it otherwise, right? So that makes us all in danger if we have no due process. So if they're willing to defy the courts on the easiest case where they already admitted they got it wrong, then of course he's just out there ready to push the courts even further, which is maybe why he's doing pushing the courts on the easiest case, trying to extend the limits of what's allowable. So this is where we need to make our stand, in my view.
I fully agree. I just was going to add that this is one of those times that history lessons really matter. And I've been finding myself digging back into examples where both in the U.S. history and world history where you start to see the breakdown of those protected rights. And one of the lessons learned from other scholars who study these things is that if you can take a stand early before they've really gathered power, you can stop it. But if we just look at Mr. Garcia and say oh, well, that's really too bad, but I didn't come here illegally, or, oh, it's really too bad about that student visa, or, oh, it's really too bad about that political enemy of Trump's. At some point, it stops being those special cases and it starts being a larger swath of the country. Anybody that's against him for fill in the blank cause. And that's when it's too late, when they've gathered that much power to be able to suppress and abuse our citizenry. So we have to stand up now with some of these smaller cases that might seem kind of distant from us, but the abuse of their rights, if we do not stand up, will eventually be the abuse of our rights.
Suppose somebody's listening to this podcast and they're thinking, all right, where do I find the Elizabeth's book? What if I want to invite Elizabeth on my podcast? What if I want to invite Elizabeth to be a speaker at my church? How can they do that? How can they find you?
You can reach out to me through my website, elizabethneumann.org. And honestly, the most enjoyable thing I'm having the opportunity to do this season is to talk to fellow believers, because that I do think the hope that Jesus offers us is exactly what we need in this dark time, but also it is going to be going back to recast what we were talking about earlier. The virtues and the values that this country was founded upon were ultimately Christian values. Now, other faiths share those values, but just historically, this country was founded by a number of Christians, and those values and virtues that got baked into the Constitution have served us so well for 250 years, and we have to fight for them. And we need to be able to make compelling cases why we want this for our children. And I think the church has a unique voice to offer right now to the country.
Amen. Elizabeth Neumann, thanks for joining the AVC podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nap.